Hi, this is Sue Phillips again with the Science Fiction Literature track for Dragon Con Goes Virtual. Today we have a reading from Michael G. Williams, and I am going to go away and let him introduce himself and his work. Thank you guys for watching.
Thank you very much, Sue, and thanks to everybody who is attending Dragon Con Goes Virtual and being a part of this very unique and in many ways exciting experience. So, for my reading, generally speaking, I write science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, mostly science fiction and urban fantasy. And for the first thing I'm going to read, I'm going to read from my novel, A Fallen Autumn, which won the 2020 Manly Wade Wellman Award from the North Carolina Speculative Fiction Foundation. This is the part that my publisher says I have to read at every reading. So that's what I'm reading right now. I settled down on my branch. Well, let me start by introducing the reading to say that A Fallen Autumn is a science fiction detective story. And it's about Valerius Bakum. He is a down on his luck, washed up private eye in the far, far future who is working what he expects will probably be his last case. And he is currently in the employ of his client, who is a golem named Alejandro. Golems are what we would call androids. And in his time, they are considered sort of semi-mystical beings full of infinite wisdom because they come from a time in the distant past that culture doesn't really remember anymore. So that's the setup. I settled down on my branch, the weight of my failing body suddenly greater than I remembered it being on the hike up. Exhaustion tied itself to all my corners and sank. Exhaustion from the night spent drinking, from my liver working overtime to deal with all that booze, from my walk across the city's landscape, from too little sleep gotten on a lumpy couch in a cold office I could no longer afford. The pink edge of the sky turned red and then yellow, and just as a tiny crescent of the sun himself started to crest over the fore barrier and golden spotlights shot westward between the buildings of my beautiful city, I heard rustling from below as someone approached quietly but not stealthily, the footfalls of a person who didn't want to disturb their own reverie by stomping around. It was Alejandro, walking into the clearing at the climax of the trail, and he was turning to face the sunrise and closing his eyes as the rays struck him all at once. I stayed where I was, quiet as I could be, my gaze shifting back and forth between the absurdly beautiful light show on the horizon and that same light playing across Alejandro's simultaneously too smooth and too human features. Do you often come here in the morning? His voice was quiet, but it carried, and anyway, he didn't exactly have a lot of competition to be heard. Alejandro turned to face me, or at least in my direction, despite me thinking I was hidden. I do, he went on. I come here to watch the sunrise at least once a week. It, walked closer to me. He didn't seem to know exactly where I was, though it occurred to me he was just pretending in order to be polite. I couldn't stand the thought of that. Couldn't stand the thought of being pandered to by a machine designed to make me like him in the first place. So I half jumped and half tumbled right out of the tree and onto the ground, the alcohol cushioning me for the moment against the worst of the pain of impact. I could tell when I landed I was a little thinner in the bones than 6 months before. It was the first time I felt frail. I love to come here, I said from where I lay, still crumpled awkwardly on the ground, my coat twisted up around me and my hat fallen to the side. I rolled over onto my side and then up onto one leg, then another, standing unsteadily and half-heartedly dusting myself off. I hoped to bother him with that. I wanted to offend the delicate sensibilities I associated with these timeless, semi-legendary creatures of metal and soft eyes and room temperature false flesh. Alejandro walked over to just outside of arm's reach and looked at me with those eyes narrowed in sympathy, a surplus of forgiveness for whatever dumb idea resulted in me being here at the literal crack of dawn. You're dying, aren't you? He said. I blinked. How did everyone know? Did the Church of the Infinite Upward Spiral of the Double Helix tattoo it on my forehead when they figured it out? We get used to noticing things, he said in response to my frown. Golems, I mean. We spend enough time around people to detect patterns. He tried to look a little self-conscious about it and almost succeeded. I figured he did the best he could do with the false facial musculature his designers gave him. I'm sorry. I'm dying, I said. Apologies are a waste of time. So is anger, Alejandro countered. No, it isn't, I said. Sometimes anger is the closest thing I can find to a reason to live. There are mornings when the only thing getting me out of bed is the desire to piss someone off. What about the other days? What gets you out of bed when you aren't angry? He looked sad, like he'd heard these sorts of antics before, and maybe he had. Maybe he'd been around since before the ancients popped their big balloon. Maybe he'd had 100,000 humans tell him all about how sad they were. I hated them too. The same thing getting anyone else out of bed. The rent, a cup of coffee, and the hope maybe I'll get laid if I'm lucky. I sure don't do it for the home-cooked meals. And that was when he kissed me, and I kissed him, and the two of us did something like making love right there in the middle of down preserves, while the sun came up on autumn, and a virtuously busy morning wound its springs without us. The sun was over the trees at the southeastern edge of the sloped opening in the forest when I awoke. It was the sun that woke me, actually, its rays on my face, the flicker of shadow and light as it played across my closed eyes. I was half dressed, but my shoes were off, my feet bare, and my coat was spread over me in lieu of a blanket. My shirt was somewhere, probably. I wasn't wearing it anyway, and my eyes weren't open yet, but I could feel it was nearby, the way you can sense an old dog by your chair or a former lover on the opposite side of an otherwise perfectly nice party. My back was curled against something firm and supporting, and I felt gentle fingers stroke the tufts of silvery black at my temples. Hematite, a man told me once. I would always love him a little for saying that. My hair there wasn't yet gray, but no longer black, and when it was wet, it looked like hematite. And he said it like that meant something deep and significant and mystical I didn't understand. Having someone's fingers run through it felt good, though. It felt like a happy memory, like something I didn't expect would happen much anymore if it ever really happened in the first place. That simple touch was a comfort to me. It's the most minor thing, and for that reason, the most missed when it's gone. I don't go long stretches without being touched, but it had been a while between caresses. This was that, a caress and more. Not exactly sexual, but not exactly platonic. It was that happy in-between we call intimate. I made myself vulnerable to other men and they themselves to me more times than I can count in my too short life. It didn't always work out, though, that my usual flavor of street trade would show basic human kindness in return for mine. None of that mattered, though. Those guys were long gone. Right that second, someone was running his fingers through my half-asleep hair, and it was intimate, and they were kind. I was vulnerable, and that was okay. For a few moments, I wasn't dying, and I wasn't scared. I wasn't lonely, and I wasn't alone. The sun felt good, and the breeze through the branches was the sound of Gaia herself telling me to go back to sleep. And I thought for a moment, I might be okay with dying fairly soon if I got to wake up like this every morning for the rest of my life. Okay, I said. I didn't move, and I didn't open my eyes because I wasn't quite ready for the moment to go away, even as I ended it. You want something, so tell me what it is, because if I say yes, I may not have much time to hold up my end of the bargain. And that's my reading from A Fallen Autumn. A Fallen Autumn is, like I said, a science fiction detective novel. It's from Falstaff Books. You can get it on Amazon. You can find it at falstaffbooks.com, or you can find links to it on my website, www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. For my second reading, I'm going to read a short story that I wrote a few years ago. It's never been published anywhere. It's what I give away to people when they subscribe to my mailing list. And there's a link for my mailing list on the screen behind me. And this is what's referred to as a Machine of Death story. Machine of Death is a science fiction subgenre. There were a couple of anthologies in this genre a few years ago. The concept is that regardless of anything else in the story, every Machine of Death story happens in a world where there is a machine that is readily available to all people, through which, through a simple blood test, is capable of telling the means by which that person will die. It provides no other information, and largely the assumption is that the machines have a grim sense of ironic humor. So, for instance, a person could walk up to a machine of death and stick their finger in, and it would prick their finger, and a second later, a sheet of paper would shoot out, and that sheet of paper would say joy. And maybe that would mean that that person was going to die eventually in a moment of sheer ecstatic delight. And maybe that means that out there somewhere is a woman named Joy who was going to run them over in 5 minutes. There's no real way to know. The machines always give the same answer, regardless of how many times someone takes the test. And that's it. So, and they always print out on a little slip of paper. So I wrote a story in the Machine of Death subgenre, and that's something that the creators of this concept freely encourage other people to do. So if you find this concept interesting, write a Machine of Death story of your own and tell me about it, because I love Machine of Death stories. So this is my Machine of Death story. Also, all Machine of Death stories are named for the method of death that is predicted for one of the characters in the story. And this is my Machine of Death story, which is called Complications. A shopping mall in the early 1980s. Buck came tearing back in from the lobby, his face red and his lumberjack arms pumping in time to the chug of his legs. He yanked off his clip-on tie, pointed a big pink frankfurter of a finger at me and hissed, "Lobby, now, customer." Normally he barked his orders, but something had him frightened, and I had never seen that, not even once during my 2 years in his employ. Mark shot me a look, eyebrows raised as though to say, well, 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 someone's a bit huffy. His eyes twinkled with amusement. I hated him a little when they did that. Everything about him could twinkle if he wanted it to. Buck didn't even stick around to see if I had obeyed him. The door to his office shot open and would have shot closed if it had been hung properly in the first place. Instead, he had to fuss with the handle before it would latch, taking some of the heat out of what he clearly wanted to turn into a good hard slam. I let myself smile just a tiny bit at that, checked my tie in the big mirror, and spritzed Banaka on my tongue. Mark clicked his cheek and winked at me. Go get him, Tiger. The lobby of the store was wallpapered a relatively inoffensive cream, but over that was a complicated interlocking pattern of elaborate and poorly defined plants falling all over one another. The attempt had been made to depict bouquets that were bursting with lurid blossoms, so busy the eye wouldn't notice how quickly the pattern repeated or where the symmetries were wrecked by a poorly placed seam. The furniture, all love seats, was patterned to match in the way magazines said the homes of rich women had been decorated in spring of the year before. The lighting was low, mostly lamps with 40-watt bulbs and thick shades casting sharp pools of light. A French marketing firm had designed the whole effect a year ago. The pitch was that their psychologists put together a space that would seem welcoming to someone tired of walking around the mall, but would also make them feel lonely. Seating for two occupied by individuals, pink and gray blossoms in the wallpaper to suggest the hair and skin of someone age past his or her prime, and bright lights right at the level where a client could notice their own wrinkled hands while they filled out the questionnaires. It was the trap we laid for lonely hearts, and it worked. Those French guys know their stuff. Our sign in the mall corridor over the store's entrance read, "Till death do us part," in flowing script stamped out in plastic. It sagged in the middle and needed dusting. Every day when I came to work, I tried to affix an apostrophe to the front of that first word through the sheer force of will, but it never worked. The woman in the lobby looked familiar to me, but so did many of the women who came here. This was because they all looked so much like one another, of a certain age, dressed well enough to afford a computerized dating service, and wearing their dyed hair up in one of those hairspray constructions suggesting an elegant whirlpool. She was daubing at her eyes with a paper tissue she'd pulled from her over-the-shoulder handbag decked out in tasteful buckles. She was obviously upset, but more than that, she looked bad. She looked like she hadn't slept right in a week. I put on my best sympathetic smile and slipped into the rattan employee chair across the slender glass-topped coffee table. I'm Jean. Welcome to our store. Is everything all right? Buck asked me to assist you. The woman's face puckered at the name and she smiled a sour little smirk. I'm sure he did. He ran out of here when I had to remind him who I am. She cleared her throat and batted big fake lashes against her cheek. She'd been very careful not to mess them up with the tissue. My name is Gloria Everett. I'm here to see if there are any new matches for me. She took a second run at smiling, this time aiming for sweet and maybe even a touch coquettish, no matter what year was on her driver's license, and I smiled back. Smiles make everything better. There's a page in our employee manual saying so, and it's the only true thing in that whole binder. Let me go and check. I hesitated. I didn't know quite what to say. I'm sorry that Buck couldn't help you. I'm sure he must have had an emergency. Gloria started to scoff. Oh, I'm the emergency. He and I, she blushed. We dated. I looked at her for a moment and it dawned on me. One of Buck's bags. He liked to talk about them in hunting terms. Mark and I privately called these women roadkill. Buck had a thing for going through the files looking for women who matched his particular preferences. Not too young, not too old, not too freshly divorced or dumped. He liked them best when they were most worried they'd started to go a little stale on the counter. He said it made them grateful, which is the worst thing I've ever heard someone say without meaning it as an insult. Buck had racked up a lot of bags over the last couple of years. He'd left his youth in the 60s and his pride in the 70s. He was turning the 80s into a smorgasbord of one-night stands with our female clientele. It was grotesque. It was like hearing a bad joke in its 100th retelling every time he walked into his office with a stack of file folders. We could hear him through that cheap hollow core door calling them on the phone and giving them the same pitch. This is Buck from Till Death Do Us Part. I was doing some work going over potential matches for you and, well, I don't quite know how to say this, but the computer suggested that we might be an excellent match. Mark and I giggled. Well, I giggled and he chuckled when we first caught on, but that turned into disgust over time. It wasn't that I was a prude by any means. Hey, we're big boys and girls. If there's no harm in it, then why not? I'm all for people having sex, trust me. But Buck was such a manipulative old troll. To watch him snare a lonely woman with that song and dance was to watch a woman give up. Everything about Gloria suddenly made sense. I see, I said. Let me go to the back and find out if the computers have come up with anything new for you. It will take me just a couple of minutes. Feel free to relax and I'll be right back. I gave her another friendly smile. No teeth, never show teeth to someone who feels vulnerable, and disappeared into our office. Mark had been listening at the door. As I crossed the drab beige back room towards the filing cabinets to find her in them, he followed me, whispering, I remember her. She's one of Buck's first catches. 2 years ago, maybe? Yeesh. He reflexively, habitually reached up and smoothed his hair away from his forehead in the mirror. Were they fighting? I found the folder and peeked inside while it was still in the drawer. Zilch in the way of prospects. There were no computers, of course, at least not in the back. We turned their surveys into little bubble sheets with special pencils and sent those off to corporate, and a computer there supposedly shuffled the deck to make matches, but that only happened when someone first came in, and then once every couple of months after that. It was September of 1982, and the computer age was all around us, but the actual computers were all down the concourse at Radio Shack. Most of the time, it was us playing matchmaker with whomever struck our fancy. The computers were big in the ads, though, them and the whole bit about taking death predictions into account when we paired them up. That was the company's specialty, the thing that set it apart until everyone else copied them. We made new clients get a death test in a little alcove off to one side of the lobby and filed that with their paperwork. On the questionnaire, after all the stuff about hobbies and religious beliefs, they had the option of confidentially expressing a preference for someone whose death might coincide with their own. You know, stick together two car accidents who both hoped to die beside their eventual mate. Or whether they wanted someone whose death would be radically different from their own. One time we got a guy in whose card read murder, and he wrote at the bottom of the questionnaire in huge letters, no guns. I don't think he cared whether we set him up with his murderer, just as long as he didn't have to get shot when it was time to go. Now that is a man who has made peace with the fates. There was very small print at the bottom of the questionnaire specifying that due to computer error and, I will always remember, the fickle ways of destiny, The company couldn't guarantee that they would find a match, or if they did, that everything, including their death, would go exactly as desired forever and ever. People didn't stop to read that, though. They didn't want to think about all the bad possibilities. They wanted to think about love and romance and getting laid. I shrugged at Mark, still hunched over the second drawer of ease. I don't know. He certainly didn't want to see her again, did he? The poor thing doesn't even have any new matches. Mark nodded towards Buck's office door. He probably buried her in there along with the rest of his private stock so he could go back for seconds like a dog with an old bone. Mark loved the giggly side of it a little bit still, I could tell, and that made me love it too, a little. He's charismatic that way. You're a beast, I whispered. She's right here, but the only bone she's getting is dry. Now, wish me luck. I'm going to give her the usual about a bunch of new matches being due any day now. Gloria's death prediction card slipped out of the back of her questionnaire and stared up at us from the floor. Cancer, just as big as life. Mark was quiet for a moment and then let out a low, quiet whistle. Oh, I gasped. Bless her heart. I shot Mark a sideways look. She does look sick, you know. A week later, I was going through the mail one morning before we opened, and there was one big envelope that had been returned, repackaged, and stamped all over. That happens sometimes, usually with married men. They would walk in, fill out the questionnaire, fake some of the contact information. Maybe they'd pay the deposit even, but then we wouldn't bill them in future. They couldn't come back either, but that didn't stop them. They wanted to taste being single again, try it on for size without having to do the legwork to get there, but they didn't want to go all the way. It was a little like pornography, in that they got to have a simulated experience. Mark said it was like going to a hooker. You pay someone to coo at you for 20 minutes and then it's back to real life. I called him a pervert when he said that, but he reminded me that I was the pervert in our friendship. Mark was basically my only straight friend, and I am absolutely certain that I was his only gay friend. We never really talked about it. He just knew, and I knew he knew, and that was that. It was the first time anyone had reacted by not reacting. The bill that had been returned to us wasn't a no such address, though. It had a letter enclosed that notified us in the simplest terms that Ms. Alice Lorenz had passed away from respiratory failure, and therefore our services would no longer be needed. There was a check enclosed for the balance due. The letter was signed by a lawyer who said he was the executor of the estate. Clients came and went at a dating service. It was no big deal. It wasn't like the phone company where you had to do a lot of razzmatazz to get the account set up or cut off. Deaths, for that matter, weren't that uncommon. Lots of old people come in wanting one last fling while they're still around. Some of them had less time left than they hoped. Sometimes they just wanted an excuse to get the death test. I filled out a little card and put it all in an envelope bound for corporate. Nothing in the book said we had to do so, but I sometimes like to pull the files on deceased clients and throw them away. It seemed the decent thing to do. I didn't want to think of their families laying them to rest amidst great and solemn ceremony, while their folder stayed behind, gathering dust, a fly strip of desire turning orange with age in a dingy room. I dug Alice out, walked over to the shredder, and started feeding it pages. Her death card was last, of course. They're impossible not to read once they're in your hand. But hers made me pause. Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. The death prediction card of Ms. Alice Lorenz was not the first place I had encountered those words. They were what the doctors had said about my friend Ralph just a year before. His mother had said those words over and over again at the funeral. They'd been like a mantra to her. She was a pharmacy assistant. She had heard of it before. It wasn't an illness that killed healthy people. Poor dear Ralph. He'd been so sweet to me. I could still see his face, just as plain as if he were standing there flirting with me still. He always presented himself as the Cary Grant type, big and athletic, but also lithe and feline, a suave jock who ran wind sprints between volumes of poetry. He'd wooed me like the male lead in an old romantic comedy. I only realized that I might have loved him when I found out he was dead. The autumn of 1981 and the winter of 1982 had been that much colder for the cavity he left in the social scene down at Ice Blue, and none of us were too proud to comment on it once or twice. Mark chucked me on the upper arm, not hard, just enough to jolt me out of my reverie. He gave me the same smile he saved for girls and for me. I don't think he was even conscious of it. I think I simply didn't register with him as a non-girl. Wake up, kid. You look like you're off in dreamland. I licked my lips, suddenly parched. and my voice croaked. I need to break all the rules in the book by digging around and reading the files of as many of Buck's bags as we know. Mark raised an eyebrow at me. After 2 breaths, he sniffed and jerked his chin up and looked down his nose at me, thumbs hooked in the front pockets of his pleated slacks. You got it, Chief. At least that made me smile. Neither of us could remember more than a couple of names entirely on our own, but we pulled their files. 2 pneumonias, 1 lymphoma, and 1 toxoplasmosis. I considered those pretty damning given what I knew, but Mark didn't seem to think it was a big deal. He was mainly helping me because I'd asked and because it was a tiny way of screwing with Buck. These aren't solid enough, I finally said. I shook my head. These were middle-aged and older people. They were already in decline. None of these were especially shocking causes of death if they lived another 3 or 4 decades. I put the folders back and leaned against the cabinet where the last of them had gone, my arms crossed on the top edge of it and my forehead resting on my hands where they overlapped at the wrist. Mark walked over and leaned back against a drawer, 3 filing cabinets down. I'm going out front for a smoke. Want to join me? I lifted my head inside. My mother says I should quit. She says they're going to kill me one day. Mark smirked. Is she right? I smiled a little. No. We didn't have any customers in back, and Buck was on his day off. We didn't even bother to put up the ridiculously over-embellished "Back Soon" sign printed on flowing script on waxed cardboard. Printed in flowing script on waxed cardboard with suction cups at the corners. We walked out into the mall corridor, quiet as the tomb on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and sat down on the bench 2 doors down from the store. Huge brass ashtrays flanked the bench, too heavy for some teenager to steal, and Mark passed me his pack out of politeness. I looked at it for a second and then took one out. I thought you were switching to those ultra-low tar kind, I said. I tried them, but they were like smoking rolled up water. I went back to my regulars. What's the point of pretending they're going to kill me? Somewhere out there is a bus with my name on it. I look both ways when I cross the street, but one's going to get me all the same. Might as well have a smoke before I go. He frowned and puffed his cigarette, held between the base of his thumb and the middle of the underside of his index finger. Mark didn't express a lot of deep thinking, but I could tell there was a machinery going at it in there. What's going to get you? He jerked a thumb at me in a vague way. Electrocution, I said. I shrugged back at him, but I suppose I still turn on the lights at night. Exactly, Mark said. It's all just a pile of paper at the end of the day. Maybe it's the 3:15 bus today. Maybe it's the 9:45 20 years from now. Maybe it's a bus that runs off the road and wipes out the burger joint where I'm having lunch. Still gotta have lunch. I smiled at him. You don't eat at burger joints. Mark smirked at me. You know what I mean. I nodded. I did. So what's this about Buck's roadkill? He tried to sound casual, but he wasn't a good actor. I opened my mouth to answer, but then closed it again, took a drag from the cigarette, took another, and then it ashed with something of a flourish. I think he's making them sick. What with? You think he's poisoning them or something? Mark hiked his eyebrows a little closer, like the lapels of a coat on a cold day. Have you ever heard of... I stopped and started over. I'm sure you've read in the... I stopped again and turned to look at Mark and said, very evenly, he's giving them something called AIDS. At least, I think he is. You may have heard it called GRID or gay cancer, but they just gave it a new name. I waved a hand in the distance, whatever they were, whoever they might be. Nobody knows what it is, but it makes people get sick and die all of a sudden from things that aren't supposed to kill them. Mostly it's pneumonia and a cancer called KS. My voice caught. I knew someone who probably died from it last year. That's the, Mark searched for the right words, then said the best he could come up with. That's the homo disease, right? No offense intended. I allowed myself smile at that. It wasn't easy being someone's only gay friend. It wasn't easy having him as my only straight friend, for that matter. Nothing had ever happened between us, and nothing ever would. I knew that, and I was glad of that, because I didn't particularly want that. Oh, Mark was a looker, sure. Dark hair, olive skin, brushing just close enough to 30 to look like he knew what to do with you. But he was like having a puppy who's also your big brother. Last year at the Christmas party, when we realized the only other people left were Buck and those weird sisters who work Thursdays and Saturdays, we'd stolen the bottle of Popov and climbed onto the roof of the mall to drink and watch the stars. I fell asleep on his shoulder and woke up with his coat stretched around both of us. He snored like a chainsaw. We were genuine peers after that, and I found it such a novel sensation that it blanked out any more salacious desires on my part. I like to think that there was a future out there somewhere in which a guy like Mark and a person like myself could be acquaintances or even neighbors. Maybe even see each other sometimes in the lobby of our nice apartment building. And we could be friends just because we wanted to be instead of because we worked together. That was probably the future of someone else, though. I doubted I would live that many centuries. Yes, I said, but it isn't just us who can get it. Mark gave me a highly doubtful glance. I don't know, I heard it's basically homos and junkies. The thought occurred to him and he chucked me on the arm again. Hey, you don't have it, do you? You're okay, right? I'm just fine, I said, but thank you for asking. Now, finish that cigarette and help me break into Buck's office. I was a better thief than Mark. He seemed to think jiggling the knob back and forth would pop the lock, but I showed him how to use 2 bobby pins, and that got us in. Mark asked me where I got bobby pins, and I rolled my eyes at him. They fall out of our customers' wigs all the time. If you ever emptied the Bissell, you'd notice these things. Buck's office looked like a wastebasket had exploded. Paper scraps and those cheap pads of thin paper you get in motel nightstands. He had stacks of them from the hourly rate no-tell out by the airport. I felt even sorrier for Gloria and Alice and all the rest of them getting hauled out there like freight and pretending it made them feel special. Mark started going through the desk and I stuck to the 2 file cabinets. I figured Buck probably liked to keep his favorites fairly organized and at the same time out of sight. It would make him feel more in charge, and he was the kind of shouting boss who clearly loved that sense of control over others. I hit pay dirt first and didn't even bother to say anything to Mark as I yanked folders from the cabinets and flipped through them for those tattletale cards. There were a bunch of files, and I tried not to tear up as I hurried through them. The first 2 had been more cases of pneumonia, but there was an explicit Kaposi sarcoma. And I knew that one because I'd called the number for Gay Men's Health Crisis when they'd opened in New York earlier that year. There were a couple of car accidents and house fires in there too, but enough of them were going to die of an unlikely disease that I was as sure as I could ever be. What to do, though? Call the cops and tell them Buck was murdering women by getting close to them? I didn't even really know what caused AIDS. No one did. There were rumors about blood, about hemophiliacs, about mosquitoes even. But it seemed pretty clear that it wasn't that easy. Some of the boys who'd slept with Ralph were getting sick, but none of them were users or hemophiliacs or anything like that. I reached up to run my hand over my own throat. Every morning I checked my lymph nodes to see if they were swollen. Every time I got out of the shower, I checked myself for little red bumps. Thanks to the machine, I knew those weren't what would kill me, but I checked anyway. I checked because Ralph never had, or maybe because he did and was scared of what he found. I checked because a dead man made love to me and I had gotten lucky. I had to do something to stop Buck. He could be killing these women and someone had to do something to keep that from happening. Poor Gloria, already starting to waste away, and she'd come sniffing back around in hopes of a pick-me-up from the very man who'd done it to her. Buck's file was in there too. I couldn't resist. I didn't even feel like I had a choice to make. I opened it, flipped to the back, and looked at the card. Complications. Huh, those damned machines. I tutted aloud, shook my head at the card itself in my hand. The nerds could say whatever they wanted about the science or the chemistry or whatever, but those machines want to drive us crazy, and we all know it. When I turned around, Mark was staring, wide-eyed, at the open bottom drawer of Buck's desk and the pistol resting inside it. I produced a long, low whistle. I bet that didn't come in the management orientation kit they mailed him when he took over from the last guy. Mark surprised me with his reticence, his open shock. I'd always figured he was more of, a man's man. He liked to play it a little James Dean sometimes, but then I supposed I'd known plenty of men who liked to butch it up in front of company. Still, I hadn't expected this. Mark was frozen stiff. It suddenly occurred to me to wonder if Mark had been in Vietnam. Mark's jaw worked up and down a couple of times, but then he just closed his eyes and said nothing. Are you okay? Mark nodded, rolled the chair back from Buck's desk, and then stood up. I need a smoke. Shoot. Never knew he had a gun. That's some crazy stuff, right? Been a long time since I've seen a gun up close. Long time. He sniffed, and something about that stabbed me right through the heart. You're not okay, I said. Mark chuckled at me, that throaty little ha ha he did when he liked to seem cool. I'll be fine. I was about to tell him we should close back up and go over the files when Buck walked through the door. Buck wasn't supposed to be there that day. He was wearing golf pants that looked even more ridiculous than you can possibly imagine, like a tablecloth from a pizza parlor was humping each of his legs. He strode in out of nowhere, and all the blood rushed straight to his face in veins that bulged out. His voice was a growl. "What the hell are you two doing in here?" Mark started to say something, but I didn't let him. I held up the file folders and waved them. "You're killing the women you sleep with. You're killing Gloria Everett, and Alice Lorenz is already dead. And almost all the women in here are going to die of the same kinds of things. You have to stop, Buck. You're murdering them." Buck looked like he might have a stroke right there, like a vessel could burst and both his eyes would fill with blood and fire. "What are you doing looking at those? Those are my files. Those are my private files." He wasn't angry that we were in his office or that I had accused him of something. He was angry that we knew. And that told me that he already knew in his own right. He didn't keep the files back there because they were his favorites. He kept them back there so we wouldn't find out. Then Gloria showed up and I went the extra mile to shred Alice's folder, and all that secrecy had gone to hell. All the breath went out of me as I realized it all. Buck stepped forward, swung one paw, and knocked the files from my hand in a single swipe. "Get out of my office. Get out of this store. You are fired. Both of you are fired. Right now. If you ever talk about anything you've seen in here, then I swear to God that I will kill you." His teeth were trying to keep the anger in, but they were doing a lousy job. He sounded like an animal straining against the cage. He meant it. He meant every word. We were fired, and we would never get to come back. And if we ever tried to tell any of those women or anyone else, then Buck would, well, he wouldn't kill us, but he would do what he could. He would probably beat us up. He would menace us wherever we got jobs next. Buck liked to push people around, and he would just keep doing that forever. I bent down, lifted the gun from the drawer, and stood back up. I held it all wrong, like a tough in a movie, low at my side, one-handed. Everything became very quiet in the office. Buck's chest was heaving, but he didn't take his eyes off the gun. "Put that back." "I don't know if this will kill you," I said. It was nearly a whisper, but that was all I could do. My eyes were welling up. I was thinking whoever had seen that bill for a dating agency and cried a little harder, or maybe, ironically, a little less, for Alice Lorenz. I was wondering how far it would spread, how long Gloria had left, whether she already knew something was wrong. I thought of Ralph and his suave jokes and his sly moves, and the way he always had a change of clothes in his car because he knew he'd always need it. He was a man-eater, but he still seemed classy somehow. He was a cad, and I'd loved him in a world where anything more complicated than a one-night stand seemed like asking for trouble. He was a prowling tomcat who'd loved his marks, been kind to us the next morning, made us breakfast because he was in just as much hot water out in the big bad world as we were, and he knew it, and he respected us for it. To us, he was a stud, a man who wanted us to feel as good as he wanted himself to feel. But to the rest of the world, he was just another dead fairy. And we were in a state that gave murderers the chair. "I don't know whether these specific bullets will kill you, I mean." My voice was quaking under the weight of all the lives that wouldn't be lived, and of the electric chair waiting for me. "Maybe you get an infection from the wound. Maybe you die on the operating table. The cards never tell us that kind of stuff. They tell us something that limits the ways we think our hand can be played out, but we still have to play out the hand." I laughed all of a sudden, a sharp bark of sorrow. I looked in the direction of Mark, blind as a bat from tears. "I am so sorry to shoot someone in front of you, because you are a wonderful human being." Then I looked back at Buck, and I pulled the trigger until smoke filled the air. And that's the end of Complications. In the last couple of minutes that I have, I'll just say, basically everything I write is science fiction, urban fantasy, or horror with as strong a queer theme as I can give it, because I feel like our experiences as a community, and specifically my experiences as a gay man, does a lot to inform those sorts of stories of what it's like to be outside the mainstream. And I feel like people who are interested in stories of what it's like to be outside the mainstream and of all the ways that that gets resolved and healed in people's lives, of found family, of unlikely friendships, of people who we encounter and we may expect the worst from them, and it turns out that they prove the best in humanity. Those are the sorts of stories that I write. And so if you find that interesting, then please feel free to check them out. Again, my website is www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. You can also find me at facebook.com/michaelgwilliamsauthor, which is currently my name in this Zoom call. My publisher is Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Thank you for your time and attention. And thank you to the Science Fiction Literature Track at DragonCon and to DragonCon Goes Virtual for having me.
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate your participation, and that was wonderful. I love both stories.
Oh, thank you very much.
And